And there was a man who walked alone in the valley where nothing grew, whose name was forgotten, even by the winds, for he had buried it long ago beneath the weight of sorrow. He wore no sandals and carried no staff, only a pouch of ashes and a broken flute tied to his belt by a thread of old wool. The people said he was mad, for each morning he rose before the sun and dug holes in the cracked ground and whispered into them as if they were listening, then poured a handful of ashes into each one and covered them again, as though planting something invisible. He did not beg, he did not curse, and he answered no one, not even the children who mocked him or the elders who warned him that the gods no longer watched this land. But the ravens followed him, and the jackals kept their distance. And once a blind woman touched his shoulder and said, "I smell something burning in your footsteps," and he only nodded. The truth was that long ago, when the rain still fell, the man had been a keeper of sacred fires, one of the few trusted to carry flame from altar to altar without letting it die. But in the year of betrayal, when kingdoms burned not by judgment, but by greed, he had failed to protect the last flame, and in his grief he had cast it into the wind and vanished into silence. Yet the fire had not vanished. It had followed him, not as flame but as ember, and lived now in his breath, in his bones, in the ashes he carried from hill to hill, whispering to the soil of things that had not yet come. And on the 7th year of his planting, when even the stars seemed to dim from weariness, a single shoot rose from one of the ash-filled hollows, not green, but golden, not soft, but glowing like a coal, trembling with light, but not heat. The villagers came, not out of hope, but out of confusion, and saw the fire blossom standing alone in the dead field, humming like a distant song. And the man knelt beside it and wept, not from sorrow, but from knowing that the fire he had lost had not died, only changed, waiting to be planted by hands that no longer needed to be right, only willing. And thus it is remembered that the fire of heaven does not punish, it waits, and those who carry ashes without bitterness are the ones through whom the flame returns. Asterisk, and the blossom of flame did not wither, though the sun scorched and the night winds pulled at it like thieves, for it was not fed by rain or root, but by the man's silence, by the years he had walked without an answer, by the soil made of sorrow ground fine and soft by mercy. And the people came daily now, not with shouts or offerings, but with questions they dared not ask aloud, and they sat in a circle around the fire blossom and listened to its quiet singing. It was not a song like any heard before, not of joy, nor of lament, but something between them, like the sound of a wound closing. And the man who had once failed, who had once cursed his own breath, now stood beside them, not as a prophet or a priest, but as a sower of flame, a gardener of what cannot be seen until it is given. And from the blossom came seed, not falling like fruit, but rising in the air like sparks from dry wood, drifting into the hands of those who still carried a memory too heavy to name. One by one, they took the seeds in silence and walked outward, each to their own valley, each to their own exile, and they planted as he had planted, with ash, with patience, with songs that were mostly breath. And though no one marked the moment it began, the world slowly lit, not in firestorms, not in vengeance, but in tiny lights hidden in fields and hills and ruins, little flares that needed no oil and feared no night. And so it is said even now, in the old places and among the dust-walkers, that the man who planted fire gave the world no temple, no scroll, no law, only a way for flame to live again through those who have nothing left but love and enough silence to listen for its voice. Asterisk, and it came to pass that the man grew old, though no one knew when age had touched him, for his back remained straight and his eyes clear, but his footsteps deepened in the dust, and the earth seemed to lean closer when he passed. He no longer planted every day, for others had taken up the work, some with trembling hands, some with scars, some with joy. They came from far-off cities and shattered tribes, drawn not by summons, but by dreams in which a voice said only, "There is a fire waiting for you." And the valleys that once cracked with thirst now hummed with quiet light, not in great fires, but in glowing stems, in warm stones, in small hearths where strangers shared silence before bread. Yet not all were pleased. There were those who had built towers of rule and law, who held fire behind walls and named themselves keepers, who saw in the ash planters a danger, for the flame that blooms in the open cannot be taxed, cannot be owned, cannot be shaped into the blade of a throne. So they came, cloaked and armored, to the valley where the first fire blossoms still stood. And they said to the man, "By whose authority do you light the earth?" And he said, "By none, and by every broken heart." They said, "This flame is unclean, unrecorded, uncontrolled." He answered, "Then let it be so, for it has burned no city, only sorrow." They raised their hands to strike down the blossom, but as they moved, the earth itself gave a sigh, not of anger, but of weariness, and the blossom did not defend itself nor burn, but released a great breath of light, and all present saw, not flame, but memory, their own forgotten wounds, their own moments of mercy, their own children before they had taught them to fear, and none could lift their hand. Again, the armored ones fell back in silence, and some removed their helmets and wept, for they remembered a time when they too had planted something and had waited for it in vain. The man turned from them not in triumph, but in stillness, and walked to the fire blossom, and for the first time it dimmed. He lay beside it, and the flame bent low, not to consume, but to listen. And his last breath passed not as air, but as ember, joining the blossom, which flickered once and fell silent. Yet the ground around it pulsed with warmth, and all who came after could feel it, not with their hands, but in their choosing. And thus it is told that though the man vanished, the flame did not die, for it had never belonged to him. It had only waited for someone willing to carry it without claiming it. And the way of the fire planter endures still, wherever ashes are sown, not in bitterness, but in hope. And after many seasons the man was no longer spoken of by name, for his name had become like the breath between songs, present yet unseen. And the people no longer said, "He planted the fire," but rather, "The fire remembered him." And in that they meant not only him, but all who walked as he walked, gently, without banners, carrying embers in silence. And children were born who had never seen the old valley, yet they dreamed of it as if it were their cradle, and when they came of age, they would find in their hands one stone warm to the touch, or one seed that glowed faintly in darkness, and they would understand without being told. Go and do likewise. In distant lands, where towers still cast long shadows, and the high places were ruled by law without love, rumors spread of the fire that needed no oil, and of people who bowed neither to threat nor crown, but only to the hush that came when truth was near. The rulers called them rebels, sorcerers, or mad, and sent scribes to record their ways. But the scribes returned with only parables and tears, and could not write what they had seen. And when the towers trembled, not from war, but from the cracking of hearts within, the rulers sent armies to seize the fire, but it had already gone to the fields, to the caves, to the hands of those who asked for nothing. In time, the map of the world changed not by conquest, but by quietness. For wherever one flame was planted, two rose, and wherever ash was poured in hope, the soil woke as if remembering a song buried too deep for centuries. The last of the old towers fell in a season of stillness when no battle was fought, and those who had once ruled stood barefoot in a field where fire blossoms rose in silence, and they did not speak, for the blossoms needed no defense, and the people of that time no longer drew lines between sacred and plain, between altar and table, for the fire had made all ground holy, and every hand that gave without seeking return was considered a priest. And so the story was no longer told of a man who planted fire, but of a fire that walked among men, seeking only those who had room for warmth and not control, and that fire was not quenched and never will be, for it lives wherever someone chooses to carry light into the dust without asking if they will see it bloom. And the story passed not in scrolls or tablets, but in gesture and gaze, in the way a mother lit her hearth with a whisper of thanks, in the way a stranger was offered bread before a name, in the way old men paused when the wind shifted, sensing a presence too familiar to name. No temple rose in the fire's honor, for every shelter built in kindness was its resting place, and no law was written in its name, for it obeyed only the shape of the human heart made low and open. Children played among the blossoms that glowed, but did not burn, learning not from books, but from listening to the earth beneath them, and the breath between words. And when they asked where the fire had come from, the elders would say only this: it came from one who carried his sorrow to the soil and did not ask for it back. And though many lands forgot their kings, forgot their wars, forgot even their years, none forgot the light, for it moved like memory quiet, stubborn, impossible to bury. And in one land beyond the stone hills and riverless plains, a young girl found a patch of ash, no larger than her hand, and knelt beside it. She had known loss, though she had no words for it. And as she sat there in the quiet, a warmth rose through her spine, and tears she had never wept came freely. She did not know the name of the man, or the story of the first planting. Yet when she reached into the ash and found there a single seed, dark, cool, but pulsing faintly, she smiled, not in joy, but in recognition, as if the seed had waited for her since the beginning of time. She did not tell her village. She did not build a shrine. She simply dug a hole near her doorway and laid the seed to rest and sang over it the song her grandmother had hummed in her last days. And 3 nights later, the blossom rose, not tall, not proud, but firm and warm and steady. And by its light she baked bread and warmed the hands of the wanderer who passed by. And so it continued, not in miracles that split the sky, but in small lights that made the night livable. The fire did not need to be seen to be real, only carried. And as long as one soul remained who believed in warmth more than glory, in giving more than guarding, in waiting more than taking, the fire would live. And it lives still, and in the far reaches of the land where no map stretched and no herald ever rode, there came a season unlike any before it, when the winds ceased for 40 days and the stars hung low in the sky like watching eyes, and the fire that had once bloomed in secret began to stir more boldly, not in defiance, but in readiness, as if the earth itself had waited generations to take one deep breath and remember its own beginning. In that time, the people did not panic, for they had been taught not by command, but by the patient rhythm of the flame, that when silence deepens, it is not always death that follows, but revelation. And in one village nestled between cliffs of ancient stone, a boy with no father and a voice that stuttered walked each night to the edge of the canyon and laid a glowing stone upon the ground. He never spoke to it, never asked of it, only sat beside it until the cold passed. On the 40th night, the stone split, not with violence, but with light so soft it seemed like breath, and from within it rose not a blossom, but a flame in the shape of a tree, without roots, suspended above the earth. And all who saw it felt not fear but memory, and those who had never wept wept, and those who had forgotten sang. For the flame had taken a new shape, not just fire, but tree, not just light, but home. And word spread again, not by trumpet or scroll, But from one heart to another, the fire grows. The fire changes. The fire waits. And many who had once hidden their seeds in secret began to plant them openly, even in the courtyards of former lords, even in the ruins of towers that had once sought to cage the flame. And the blossoms came faster now, and some no longer glowed but sang, and others gave fruit that warmed the bones and healed forgotten wounds. And in each land a new kind of fire was born, not to consume, but to commune. And it was then that the people no longer said, "The man who planted fire," nor even "the fire that walks," but simply "the way." And none could say where the way began, nor where it ended, only that it passed through every place where a soul had chosen. Love over fear, light over pride, hope over silence. And when the last wind returned, and the stars rose once more into their rightful heights, the earth was not the same. It was not brighter. It was kinder. And in the kindness there was fire, and in the fire there was peace. Asterisk, and there came time, not marked by stars or sun, when the fire began to speak, not in words, but in dreams shared across many sleepers. In distant lands, a fisherman dreamt of a door made of ash that opened into light. A widow dreamt of a hand made of flame, reaching gently toward her emptiness. A child, too young to know loss, woke weeping from a dream of the whole earth breathing as one. These visions spread quietly, as the fire had always done, and the people began to gather in places not chosen by power, but by peace. They did not name these places cities nor sanctuaries, for no walls were raised and no boundaries drawn. They simply called them circles. In the center of each circle was a single blossom, sometimes bright, sometimes barely visible, and the people brought no offerings but stories. They shared not what they had, but what they had endured, and in each story the fire leaned forward, flickering with recognition. And slowly from these circles rose a new language, not spoken but lived, a language of presence, of silence held without fear, of giving without counting. Those who once ruled by decree could not understand it, and those who chased greatness missed it entirely. But the humble, the broken, the watchers, and the weepers, they became fluent in it, and where they walked, the fire followed, not behind, but within. And in one forgotten region, beneath a sky where no stars shone for 100 nights, an old woman sat alone beside cold soil. She had planted nothing in decades. She had buried all her children. She had spoken no words in years. But the fire came to her, not as light, not as warmth, but as memory, fierce, soft, undemanding. And in that moment she hummed a tune she had not known she remembered. The earth beneath her stirred. The soil softened. And without her lifting a finger, a blossom rose. She smiled and said the first word she had spoken since her youngest died. Enough. And the fire understood, and answered not with flame, but with peace. From her small place on the edge of forgetting, a wave of calm rolled out across the world, and even the restless knew rest. And so it was written not in ink, but in breath, that the fire which once bloomed in ash had become the rhythm of life. Itself, no longer separate, no longer foreign, it was in the hand that reached for the stranger, in the tear that fell for another's pain, in the song sung only once and never again. And it would endure, not by strength, not by fear, but by those who carried it gently, never owning, always giving, one light at a time. Asterisk, and so the world did not end, nor was it perfected, but it was mended, slowly, like old cloth passed, through many hands, stitched not by one, but by all who remembered how to wait. The fire no longer astonished. It became companion. It was found in the breaking of bread, in the pause before anger, in the arms that remained open when another turned away. And though it was never again seen in the fullness it first revealed, as tree, as blossom, as voice and flame. It was known more deeply, like the soul of a friend who no longer needs to speak to be understood. Generations rose, who never saw the towers, who never feared the dark as their ancestors had, and when they heard the stories, they did not marvel at the miracles, but at the patience. They asked, did they truly wait that long? Did they truly believe, even when nothing changed? And the elders nodded and said, that is the deeper fire. In a land of wide rivers and white stones, a young boy wandered alone and found no fire, no blossom, no song. He wept in silence, not for what he had lost, but because he had never known what others had spoken of. That night he dreamed not of flame, but of footsteps, countless footsteps, moving slowly over dry earth. When he awoke, he stood and walked without knowing why, and as he walked, others joined him, not asking, not leading, and they moved together through barren land. After 7 days, they came to a place where the wind ceased and the earth was cracked like broken pottery. There, without word or sign, each of them knelt, pressed their hands into the dust, and waited. They planted nothing. They prayed nothing. They waited. And from that waiting, the fire returned, not as blaze, not even as ember, but as stillness deeper than sleep. And they understood. The fire was no longer something to find. It was something to become. Thus it was told in the final days of the long remembering that the flame had never been about light or heat or wonder. It had always been the invitation to be transformed, to love without reward, to give without record, to suffer without hardening. And the last words spoken in the oldest circle were not carved in stone nor etched in metal, but whispered from parent to child as the stars returned overhead. Be the fire that listens. Be the fire that stays. And from that final whisper, the circles dispersed. Yet each seed of fire they carried continued its slow work. In one village, the humble flame coaxed an orchard from rocky soil where no tree had dared to grow. In another, it softened a hardened heart so that the widow who had taught her children only grief discovered her own laughter once more. Travelers spoke of these wonders as if they were ancient myth, yet none could say who had first carried the ember. They only knew it called them forth, from the richest court to the loneliest outpost, to kneel and wait. And so it was that child born at the edge of the desert, whose parents had never heard of the flame, found a single glowing spark buried in the sand. She cupped it in her hands and felt its warmth kindle courage within her. And when her village was besieged by hunger, she offered it freely to all who came, and they shared a meal beneath its light, and the fear that had ruled them fell away. Across the seas, in lands that did not know dust or drought, scholars puzzled over reports of a light that answered sorrow with song. They wrote treatises and built observatories, but the flame eluded their instruments, for it answered only to the soft voice of a broken soul. And always the flame moved on, seeking not acclaim but communion, until at last, when the world had grown too loud and too bright with its own achievements, it returned to the place of its first planting, the valley of ash and silence, and there, without herald or ceremony, it blossomed anew in hundreds of colors, a living tapestry of memory and mercy. And the people gathered once more, not to worship a miracle, but to remember the way, that fire is not conquered by flame, but carried in the offering of our vulnerability, and that wherever 2 or 3 are willing to wait without demand, there, the flame will light their path and lead them home. And in that valley where the first flame had once taken root, where the ash had turned to blossom and silence to song, a great stillness came over the land, not the stillness of ending, but of fullness. Elders stood shoulder to shoulder with children, and though many bore no memory of the man who first planted the fire, all bore witness to the fruit of his obedience. The blossoms no longer startled them, they nourished. The light no longer amazed, It guided, and from the center of the valley, where the fire had once stood alone, now rose a great tree, not of wood or leaf, but of flame shaped by grace. Its roots stretched unseen beneath distant oceans and deserts, beneath cities and ruins, and wherever its roots passed, hearts stirred. Not all heeded that stirring. Many turned away, preferring the comfort of stone and law. But a remnant always remained, those who were not strong in body, but deep in mercy, not rich in gold, but generous in wounds. These were the new planters, nameless and scattered, sowing fire in places where no hope should grow, whispering songs in tongues older than language, waiting with a patience that even time could not exhaust. And one day, far from the valley, in a land ruled by towers and governed by fear, a prisoner sat alone in a windowless cell. He had no memory of light, only chains and cold. But as he sat in silence, a warmth grew beneath his ribs, faint as breath, but steady. He wept without knowing why. In the corner of his cell, a flicker appeared, not fire, but something gentler, like memory learning to live again. And in the morning, when the guards opened the door, they found no man, only the chains lying open and the faint scent of wild blossoms. The prisoner had not escaped. He had become flame, and so it was told in lands both near and forgotten that the fire did not end with the man who planted it, nor with the woman who wept beside it, nor with the child who carried it through the dust. The fire moved as the spirit moved, unbidden, unstoppable, unseen by the proud, but dwelling in the meek. No longer did the people speak of a single tale, but of 1,000 threads, all woven through the same fire, all pointing toward the same truth, that the fire was not given to conquer but to call, not to burn but to beckon. And all who answered it, even in fear or weakness, found themselves not consumed but remade. For the fire had become the heart of the world, and the world, at last, had learned to listen. And though the seasons turned and kingdoms rose and crumbled, though names were forgotten and stones gathered moss where temples once stood, still the fire moved, not in haste, not in vengeance, but in quiet fidelity. It traveled through stories whispered from mother to child, through songs sung by shepherds under cold stars, through the silent prayers of the exiled who had no temple but their breath. And wherever injustice reigned, the fire did not rage it. It waited in the footsteps of the oppressed, in the trembling hands of those who chose mercy over retaliation, in the empty spaces where power refused to dwell. And when the time was full, when all seemed lost, it spoke again, not with thunder or sword, but with the still voice that has no rival. Come. And in one such time, a young scribe sat alone among ruined scrolls, his faith reduced to ink stains and unanswered questions. He had studied all the laws, recited all the prophets, but the fire had eluded him until one night, as he fell asleep beside the broken altar, he dreamed of a table in the wilderness where strangers broke bread and wept together without shame. When he awoke, he left his pen behind. He no longer wrote commandments, he listened to wounds. And wherever he walked, strangers followed, not to learn doctrine, but to be seen. They called him teacher, but he called them brothers and sisters. And though no flames crowned his head, the fire went with him, hidden in his gentleness. And over the years, others rose not to lead, but to carry. A builder who fashioned shelters where no one paid rent. A healer who sat in silence with the incurable. A child who forgave the soldier who shattered her home. None of them knew the full story, but each bore a fragment. And that was enough. For the fire did not demand comprehension, only participation. And finally, in a day no calendar marked, when the stars had forgotten their names, and the earth sighed in longing, the fire ceased to roam. Not because its work was done, but because it had found its home not in one place, but in every heart that had chosen love over fear, truth over comfort, waiting over grasping. It no longer needed to appear, for it had become the breath of the world. And those who lived by its rhythm were called not heroes, not saints, but keepers of the quiet flame. They did not seek to be remembered, only to remember. And that, at last, was enough. Asterisk, and among the keepers of the quiet flame, there was no temple, no throne, no holy mountain to ascend, for their worship was not in a place, but in the way they walked. One shared her last loaf with a stranger, not knowing she had done anything divine. One knelt by a wounded beast and sang it to peace, not knowing the stars above listened in reverence. One forgave her father with a trembling voice and was never the same again. These were not miracles in the old sense. They were gentler, smaller, but no less eternal. For every act shaped by the fire echoed beyond time. It was written in the dust by feet that walked humbly. It was spoken in silence when no comfort could be offered, only presence. It was carved not on stone, but in choices, in the giving up of violence, in the refusal to turn away from pain. And though the world still knew sorrow, still bled from wounds both ancient and fresh, the flame remained. In cities torn by greed, it flickered in the quiet resistance of the honest worker. In lands shattered by war, it kindled in the hands that chose to rebuild instead of destroy. In hearts full of grief, it warmed the memory that joy once was, and could be again. And sometimes, in deep night, it sang not aloud, not in language, but in a knowing that passed from soul to soul, like a river beneath the surface. And so, the story did not end. It could not end, for it had never been only a story. It was the living breath of mercy, passed like fire from wick to wick, never owned, always offered. And the keepers knew this, that they did not carry the flame to be seen or followed, but simply to keep it alive. For one day, in a time not yet born, someone would need it again. And when that day came, when hope had grown cold and the sky turned silent, someone would find it waiting, in a whisper, in a tear, in an open hand, and they, too, would become part of the fire. And many years passed, unmeasured by kings or calendars, for the fire cared not for time as men counted it. It moved through generations, as breath passes through a body unseen, constant, vital. The keepers no longer told the tale as one beginning and one end, but as a great river with countless tributaries, each life a current, each act of kindness a ripple. They no longer sought to define the fire, for they had learned that to name it too tightly was to lose it. Instead, they lived it in their rising and their resting, in the way they waited for each other, in the way they bore witness to suffering, without turning away. In the corners of the world where no scripture reached, the fire spoke through songs sung to children, and through the long labor of mothers who had nothing to give but their hands. And though no throne declared it holy, no empire claimed its blessing, still the flame grew, quiet as dawn. Not in one distant land, forgotten by most, and ruled by no one, a young girl walked the forest paths barefoot, her heart heavy with questions that no elder had answered. She did not seek power, only peace, but the world had offered her none. Her mother was gone. Her father never knew her. The village spoke of hope, but lived by fear. And one evening, beneath the shadow of great trees, she sat down and wept, not with bitterness, but with the weariness of one who has carried too much for too long. There, in that stillness, she felt it not a flame to see, but something rising inside her, not consuming, not commanding, only present. And in that moment, she did not feel strong or wise or chosen. She simply felt loved, and it was enough. She stood, wiped her face, and began to sing, not a song she had learned, but one that came from the ground beneath her. And though no one heard her that night, the trees listened. And the song lived on not far away, across mountains and waters. And centuries, another man sat by the ruins of a temple his ancestors had built in pride and defended in violence. He was the last of a line who had believed themselves guardians of truth, yet truth had crumbled with their walls. And in the ashes, he found no voice, no vision, only silence. For many days he fasted, not to earn revelation, but because he had no appetite for illusions. And on the seventh night, a wind rose through the broken stone, and he remembered a story he had once scoffed at of a fire that chose the meek. He bowed his head, not in defeat, but in surrender. And when he stood, the fire was with him, not to restore his line, but to release it. He wandered then, speaking only when needed, healing only when asked, and wherever he walked, strangers felt the burden in their chests lift, though none could say why. Thus the fire passed not in triumph, not in spectacle, but in fidelity, in lovers who stayed, in friends who forgave, in hands that chose to open instead of close. And in time, a new word arose among the keepers, not fire, not flame, but presence. For they had come to understand that the fire had never been separate. From the one who gave it, it was not a tool or a symbol. It was the very breath of the one who had formed all things from dust and longing. And to carry it was not to wield it, but to welcome it. And so they walked scattered, unknown, often mocked, sometimes martyred, but never extinguished. For even in death, the fire leapt to the next soul who watched in silence, who waited in love. And in every age, though the names changed and the fears wore new faces, the flame endured. It crossed oceans in songs. It lit prison cells in dreams. It softened tyrants in their sleep. And to this day, in places you will never read about, there are keepers who rise before the sun, kneel beside their neighbors, and let the flame move. Through them, like breath unseen, unending, alive. Asterisk, and so it was that the fire, having passed from hand to hand, from tear to tear, from silence to song, no longer needed to be sought in the heavens or summoned through thunder. It had woven itself into the fabric of the world, not as spectacle, but as quiet endurance. In marketplaces where coins clattered and tempers flared, it flickered in the patience of the merchant, who gave more than was owed. In cities where towers pierced the sky but hearts were empty, it dwelt in the one who noticed the forgotten and sat beside them. In lands where war taught children to fear their own shadows, it moved through those who rebuilt not only walls but trust. And the keepers of the flame, though they bore no sign upon their foreheads and claimed no title, knew each other by the way they listened, the way they paused before speaking, the way they chose peace, even when peace cost more than pride. And though their numbers were never many, they were never few. In every generation, in every place where despair dared to root itself, one would rise not in defiance, but in quiet faithfulness, and open their heart wide enough for the flame to dwell. These were the prophets unrecognized, the saints unsainted, the storytellers whose only sermon was how they lived. And their stories wove into one another like rivers into the sea, each one different, yet all telling the same truth, that light is never lost when it is given. One day, long after names had faded and kingdoms were dust, a child stood in a field of ash. Her people had scattered. Her books were gone. She had no teacher, no temple, no map. But she had one thing, a memory not her own, passed like a whisper through generations, a tale of fire that could not be quenched, of a love that chose weakness. To heal the world, she closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the field was not burning but blooming, not with roses or grain, but with small glowing lights that pulsed like heartbeats. She knelt. She did not speak, and the flame answered not with words, but with welcome. From that place she walked, barefoot and unafraid. And others, seeing her peace, followed not to serve her, not to praise her, but to remember with her. Together they lit candles not of wax, but of mercy, and carried them into places long forgotten by hope. And every time someone asked, where did the fire begin? They smiled, not because they knew, but because they had learned it didn't matter. The fire was here. It was enough. And thus the story lives, not because it is told, but because it is lived. And as long as one heart remains willing to wait, in silence, to love in weakness, to forgive without measure, the fire shall never die. For it was not born of man, nor bound by time. It is the breath of the eternal, the presence of the unseen, and it lives now, always in those who choose the way of light. And from that moment forward, the child who had walked from the ash was never alone. She did not become queen, or prophet, or warrior, yet her footsteps traced paths that others began to follow. She planted no banners, carved no laws, yet wherever she lingered, peace slowly returned like grass reclaiming stone, like dawn after a night too long. The flame she carried was not bright, yet it was steady, and those who sat near her felt. Their burdens shift, not vanish, but grow lighter because they no longer bore them alone. She told no one to follow. She demanded no name for the flame. And because she asked for nothing, people gave freely bread to the hungry, shelter to the stranger, forgiveness to the enemy. And in time, these small offerings grew into communities, not built of stone but of promise. The promise that love without pride is still the most powerful force on the earth. In a distant land, a king with many crowns and few joys heard of this girl and the fire that never failed. He sent scouts and scribes, emissaries and spies, but none returned with proof-only stories. Frustrated, he went himself, disguised and alone. He traveled for 40 days, his gold heavy and his soul hollow, until at last he came to a village, by a stream where children laughed without fear. There he found her not in a temple, but sitting beneath a fig tree, mending a torn garment for a blind man. He asked her where the fire was, and she looked at him, not with awe, not with judgment, only kindness, and said, "You are already standing in it." The king laughed, thinking it a riddle. But that night he stayed in the village. No guards, no feast, no throne, only silence and stars and strangers who welcomed him without knowing his name. And in the morning, for the first time in years, he wept, not for loss, but for the part of him he had forgotten. He left behind his gold and his crown, and returned to his kingdom not to rule, but to serve. His council called him mad, his nobles rebelled, but the poor rejoiced, and the land, long parched, began to yield again. And so the flame grew not brighter, but deeper. It flowed beneath borders, between languages, beyond creeds. It lit the hearts of those who had never heard the tale, because truth needs no history to be true. It made poets of mourners, healers of prisoners, families of orphans. And always it whispered the same invitation: come as you are. Bring nothing but your longing. Leave nothing but your love. And now, if you are listening wherever you are, however broken or burdened or unbelieving, know this: the flame waits not in the heavens, but in the simple sacred act of giving yourself away. You are not too late. You are not too far. The fire is already burning. You have only to step into it. And when you do, you will not be consumed. You will be changed, and the story will continue through you. And so the fire moved onward, not as a flood to overwhelm, but as a tide that washed gently over the weary edges of the world. It did not demand monuments, nor did it require belief. It simply waited for someone to notice it, within a gesture of kindness, within a sigh offered for another's sorrow, within a choice made quietly when no one saw. And in one village near the sea, where storms had taken more than they had spared. The people rebuilt not just with stone, but with song. They sang not to forget the past, but to give it rest. And the fire danced in their harmonies, echoing through. Their laughter and tears alike dot there. A fisherman named Eli sat each dawn by the shoreline, casting his net not for fish, but for prayer. He was not wise in Scripture, nor did he speak of visions, but each morning, as the sea breathed against the land, he whispered names of the lost, the broken, the ones who had no one else to remember them. And though he never saw a miracle, never heard a voice from the clouds, his village spoke of peace that lingered after he passed by, and of bread that always seemed to last one day longer than expected. One day, a stranger arrived. Her clothes were torn by travel, and her eyes held stories she did not yet have the strength to tell. The villagers welcomed her without question. Eli offered her no sermon, only space. And as she sat with him by the water, neither speaking, she felt something loosen within her chest, something she had kept locked away for years. She began to weep, and Eli said only, "Let the sea carry what you can no longer hold." And so she did. In time, she began to sing again, not the songs of her past, but new songs born of pain, but not owned by it. Then others gathered, and soon, around that small shore, voices rose not to prove, not to perform, but to heal. And the fire, though unseen, shone like a lantern at the center of their shared silence. And it was said, long after they were gone, that no ship ever sank near that coast, not because of magic or might, but because kindness guarded those waters. And the fire had found yet another home. And many seasons passed, yet the flame did not grow dim. It wove itself into the breath of the world invisible, unbroken, moving through hearts that did not know they carried it. In distant hills where no roads reached, an old woman named Talia kept bees and spoke to them as if they were her kin. No one came to hear her stories, yet she told them still, to the wind, to the flowers, to the stars who had listened longer than any man. And when a child, lost and trembling, appeared at her gate one night, she opened her door without question. She fed him honey and warm bread, and wrapped him in a cloak sewn from her youth. She asked not his name, only if he was weary. He nodded, and she said, "Then rest, for the fire keeps watch." The boy stayed for a year. He spoke little, but he watched everything, how she rose before dawn, how she hummed to the bees, how she prayed not with words, but with care. And when the time came for him to leave, he asked her, "What should I carry with me?" She placed a small jar of honey in his hands and said, "Remember that sweetness survives even in wild places. Carry that." He walked away that morning, never to return. But wherever he went, he fed the hungry, even when he had little. He listened to the broken, even when it tore his heart. And many said he had fire in his eyes, though no flame was ever seen in another place. Far to the east, a scribe named Damar wrote the story of the fire, not on scrolls, but on the walls of forgotten wells. He knew the thirst of those who passed by. He knew they would never come to the temple, would never read the sacred books. So he carved in secret, one word at a time, by moonlight: peace, mercy. Begin again. You are not alone. And years later, long after his death, a young woman fleeing war drank from such a well. She read the words, and for the first time since her family had fallen, she believed that her story was not over, and still the flame passed on. A father taught his daughter to hold her anger like a stone warmed in the sun, not to throw it, but to understand its weight. A prisoner forgave his captors in a dream, and woke with his chains broken, not by magic, but by resolve. A musician played for a crowd that had lost everything, and in the hush between his final notes, they remembered who they were. The fire needs no temple, no doctrine, no nation. It moves through love that expects nothing, through truth spoken, gently, through hands that heal without fame. And to this day, it waits for you, for me, for all who still believe that light, once shared, cannot be taken back. Asterisk, and so the story continued, not in thunder or flame from the sky, but in the quiet breath of those who had chosen the path of light without knowing its name. In the western hills, where the clouds hung low and the wind smelled of cedar and ash, a boy named Joram tended sheep not his own. He was not born free. His family had long been bound to a lord who ruled with polished cruelty. But within his heart, something stirred that chains could not touch. He would sing to the sheep not to guide them, but to comfort them. And the songs he sang were older than the stones, older than the names carved into his people's pain. One day, while searching for a lamb lost in the thorns, he came upon a stranger resting beside a spring, cloaked not in finery, but in silence. The stranger asked for no food, offered no prophecy. He only asked Joram, "Why do you sing when no one listens?" Joram answered, "Because the silence is listening." The stranger smiled and said, "Then the silence is no longer empty." And with that, he vanished. Joram returned to the flocks, but the moment lingered. That night, under the stars, he lit no fire, but still felt warm. And in the days that followed, his voice grew stronger. Others heard him sing and remembered songs of their own. The other shepherds, once hard from hunger, began to share what they had. They watched over each other's flocks. They protected the weak. They stopped selling each other's secrets for coins. And though no law had changed, the valley changed by the smallest things, like frost melting under breath. And elsewhere, across the sea in a city of towers and shadows, a woman named Alma walked barefoot through the courts of judgment, where names were lost and dignity was bartered for favor. She bore no title, yet people stepped aside as she passed. She did not speak loudly, yet her silence quieted even the cruel. She carried a basket of bread each day, giving to any who asked, never waiting to see if thanks would follow. And in a time of plague, when others hid behind gates and prayers, she stayed among the sick. She bathed their wounds, sang to them, and wept when they passed. Her tears were not for despair, but for love too deep to withhold. One day, when asked why she did not flee the city's ruin, she said only, "If I leave, who will remain to light the candles?" When she finally fell ill, the people came not to mourn, but to keep her promise. They lit their own candles, placed their bread beside the poor, and carried the fire forward. And in time, no one remembered her face. But the bread never stopped being shared, and the candles never stopped glowing. Thus the fire endured in forgotten places, in broken hands, in stories that begin without greatness and end without glory. And still, it waits not at the edge of the world, but in the next act of quiet courage, in you, in me, in the choice to forgive, in the decision to return kindness for cruelty, in the breath that speaks peace instead of anger. Asterisk, and the story flowed onward like a river too deep to see its beginning, its end hidden in the folds of time, far beyond the cities and coasts, in the highlands where snow whispered secrets into. The wind, an old man named Simeon, lived in a house carved from stone and silence. The villagers called him mad, for he spoke to the mountains and listened to the fire in the hearth as though it answered. But when children were lost in storms, it was to his door they ran. And when grief visited a home, it was Simeon who arrived. Without being called, sitting wordless in the corner, his presence like a lamp left burning through the night. Few understood his ways, yet many felt lighter when he was near, as though a burden they could not name had been lifted. One winter, a stranger arrived, draped in furs, his eyes hollowed by years of seeking. He had crossed deserts, sailed stormed, seas scaled ridges sharp with frost all, to find the secret of the fire he had once glimpsed in a dream as a child. He believed it was hidden, guarded, earned only by the worthy. He expected trials, tests, and tablets of revelation. But Simeon poured him tea and asked no questions. Days passed. They sat in silence, watching snow fall and flames dance. And, slowly, the stranger wept, not for what he had lost, but for what he had never needed to seek. Simeon said only, "The fire was never lost. You are simply not still enough to see it." And in that moment, the stranger understood. The sacred was not in the reaching, but in the resting dot far away, across a plain of dust and winds, a young woman named Nara, born into war and raised on revenge, stood at the edge of her enemies. Broken city. She carried a blade forged by grief, and her heart was a furnace of memory. But in the silence of that ruined place, she found only children hiding, hungry, afraid. And one, too small to speak, reached for her hand. She did not raise her sword. She raised the child. And that was the beginning of her redemption, not marked by grand gestures, but by the slow undoing of hatred. She stayed among the ruins, feeding the orphaned, burying the forgotten, learning the names of the ones she was told were monsters. And with each name remembered, the fire within her changed, no longer fueled by fury, but by mercy. And so it came to pass that the fire, carried not in temples nor in scrolls, but in hearts made soft by grace, crossed even into lands where no stories had yet been spoken. In a village wrapped in red earth and desert winds, where people rose before the sun and slept under stars without walls, a child was born beneath a canopy of silence. She was named Leah, which means belonging to the breath, for when she cried her first cry, it sounded not like sorrow, but like song. Her mother, who had never known peace, wept not from pain, but from all, for in that fragile sound she heard hope returning. Leah grew not with the strength of warriors, nor the beauty of queens, but with the deep gentleness of those who see what others miss. She spoke to ants and birds and broken things, and nothing feared her. At 5 years old, she touched the twisted hand of a man whom others had cast out, and where she touched him, he did not heal, but he wept for the first time in decades, and said he felt clean. At 10, she followed her shadow into the wilderness, and returned with a lion cub curled at her feet, not tamed, only trusted. And at 12, when war came thundering toward her people with banners high and eyes blind, she stood alone at the village gate and said not a word. But the commander, hardened by years of conquest, saw her standing like a reed in the wind and lowered his blade. He did not understand why, only that he could not pass her. The fire in Leah was not of miracles, but of presence. It reminded the violent of their mothers. It made the proud remember their childhood. It called the lonely by name. And though she grew older, she never left her home, for the world came to her not to be amazed, but to be heard. Her house became a haven for those with questions too heavy for priests, and wounds too old for physicians. She offered no doctrine, only listening. And in her listening, truth rose like a tide, washing shame from the hearts of many. One night, as Leah sat beneath the tree where her mother had first sung her name, a stranger arrived, a woman dressed in blue, eyes filled with fire and grief. She had lost everything, land, family, faith. She knelt before Leah and asked, "Why did God not come when I begged?" Leah took her hands, calloused and trembling, and said, "Because he came through you, every time you chose to love when you were not loved in return." And the woman wept, not because it answered her question, but because it set her free from needing an answer. And so the flame endured, passed like breath between the living, given but never used, gentle but never weak. It lit no sky, summoned no thunder, carved no empire, yet it remained, always, in the broken voice that still chose to sing, in the wounded hand that still chose to give, in the dying soul that still chose to bless. The story does not end because the fire is not finished. It waits in every act of quiet courage, in every kindness done in secret, in every choice to love when hatred would be easier. Asterisk and the flame, carried forward not by might but by mercy, passed into the hands of those who had never held power and yet shaped the world more than kings. In the shadows of a great city where towers pierced the clouds and men spoke of conquest and gold, there lived a woman who swept its streets. Her name was Miriam, though no one asked it. She wore no robes of honor, but each morning before the sun could burn the filth from the stone, she was there quietly gathering the discarded remains of another day's forgetting. And though her hands bled, her heart did not grow hard. She would smile at children who spat, whisper blessings for the drunkards who cursed her, and leave a single flower each week on the doorstep of the prison gates. One day, a man condemned for murder was released after 30 years behind walls. No one came to meet him. He wandered the streets like a ghost, avoided by all. But Miriam, passing with her broom, paused. She looked into his hollowed eyes and said simply, "You must be hungry." She took him by the hand, fed him bread and warm milk, and sat with him until night fell. He asked her why she had done it, and she answered, "Because you are not beyond the fire." And in the days that followed, he changed. Not all at once, and not without struggle, but slowly, like a stone warmed by morning light. He began to help her sweep the streets. He began to speak with gentleness. And when he died years later, the people said he had been a saint. But Miriam only smiled and said, no, he was simply willing to be lit again. The flame moved still not in thunder or judgment, but in the dust of the everyday. In a village surrounded by trees so ancient that even time bowed to them, a blind man named Oren sat on a bench carved from cedar. Though his eyes saw nothing, he saw what many missed. When strangers came, uncertain and silent, he would say, "You've come far. Sit, the forest has waited long to hear your voice." And they would sit, and they would speak. And though he answered with few words, those who left him did so changed. Though the questions they carried had become lighter, not by solution, but by being shared. One winter, when a terrible storm broke the great trees, and the people wailed for what had been lost, Oren stood in the center of the clearing and began to sing. He sang not to fix, but to remember. And one by one, voices joined him. And in their song, they did not mourn the past, they blessed the roots for what they had given. And in the spring, saplings rose where silence once reigned. Not tall yet, not strong yet, but reaching. The fire was there in song, in silence. In mercy offered when it was not deserved. It did not age. It did not tire. It simply searched, gently and always. For those whose hearts could become its home dot, it is searching still. Asterisk, and so the flame, never loud, never forceful, continued its journey through the soft places of the world, the cracks where light enters, the moments between breaths. In a northern land, where the winds howled like wolves and the sky burned with ribbons of light, there was a girl named Elia who spoke with the snow. She was the daughter of fishermen, raised by salt and silence. Yet when she walked among the sealands, ice-covered cliffs, even the birds seemed to hush to hear her. She never preached, never claimed visions, yet her presence was like fire beneath frost subtle, persistent, and impossible to ignore. When famine came and the sea gave nothing, the people grew fearful and cold, not from the wind, but from each other. They closed their doors, guarded their food, and forgot the names of kindness. But Elia went from home to home, sharing what little her family had, fish bones for broth, stories for comfort, and songs for warmth. Some turned her away, some cursed her foolishness, but she never ceased. And when she returned to her small hut each night, she whispered to the snow, "May what melts here return in mercy." One evening, as the village gathered in hunger and silence around the last fire, a stranger appeared at the edge of the sea. He carried no weapon, only a net, and he asked if he might fish. The elders mocked him, for the waters had been dead for moons. But Elijah brought him to the shore and sang as he cast the net. And though the waves had held nothing for weeks, that night the net came back heavy, not with fish alone, but with shimmering light like the dawn. The stranger said nothing. He simply nodded to Elijah and walked away. No one knew his name, but the fire in his eyes mirrored the one she carried out from that night on. The village shared again, not because they had much, but because they remembered who they were. And Elijah became not a prophet, but a sister to all. She married no one, bore no children, but generations spoke of her as the mother of mercy, the one who sang to the snow until it wept out elsewhere in the crumbling ruins of a city. Swallowed by war, a boy named Toph stood in the shadow of a broken statue. He had lost his family, his voice, and nearly his soul. But one morning, digging through rubble for wood, he uncovered a page singed, faded, and torn. Upon it were words, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." He read them aloud with cracked lips, and something stirred. He kept the page close to his heart and read it to others hiding in the darkness. With time, he learned to read more, then to write, then to teach. And long after the city was rebuilt, when great men took credit for its rising, a small school stood at the edge of the old quarter, no gold, no flag, only books and silence. And over its door were the same words from that page. The flame had passed to him, and he gave it away without knowing he had dot, so it continues. The fire, older than time, still leans gently toward those who wait without knowing what they wait for. It chooses no race, no nation, no name. It lives wherever compassion is stronger than fear, wherever humility defeats pride, wherever someone, even with trembling hands, dares to say, "Let me carry this, so you don't have to." The fire still burns. The story is still being written. And in a valley forgotten by maps, where mist lingered long after the sun had risen, there lived a man named Darrell who could not speak. From birth, his tongue had never shaped a single word, but his hands spoke with grace, and his eyes held a depth that silenced quarrels. He tended a garden by a stream, where no one else had thought to plant, where the soil was dry and stubborn. But each morning, Darrell would kneel and press his palm to the earth, not as master, but as servant. He whispered with his silence, and the earth listened. In time, blossoms bloomed where thorns once ruled. Travelers began to visit, drawn not by stories, but by peace. They found no sermons, no songs, only a man who offered water without question, shade without judgment, and rest without price. Some said he was a prophet. Others said he was a fool. But the broken stayed, and those who stayed were made whole not by miracles, but by being seen. One day, a furious man came to the garden, sword on his hip and hate in his eyes. He demanded answers, why the world had taken his son, why prayer had not saved his wife. Darrell said nothing. He led the man to a quiet bench, poured him tea, and sat beside him until dusk. When the man finally wept, it was not in defeat but in release. That night, he slept beside the stream for the first time in years without dreams of fire. And in the morning, he left his sword on the bench and walked into the hills. Lighter, the fire passed again, without sound, in silence, in stillness, in kindness so ordinary it is often missed. Yet it moved the world, for this is how the flame travels, not through thrones or thunder, but hand to hand, heart to heart, life to life, quiet, unseen, unstoppable, a single light in the dark, and then another. Asterisk and thee. Story like the fire, pressed forward, no ending written, no map drawn, only a path lit step by step. Far to the east, where the sun rose behind a veil of lavender clouds, and the rivers sang like flutes in spring, there was a boy named Jael who was born into silence. But not like Darrell, for Jael was not without speech, but without anyone to hear it. His people lived scattered among the hills, their songs stolen by time, their stories forgotten even by themselves. The world passed them by, and they passed each other by, each wrapped in their own shadow of survival. Jael's voice, though strong, seemed swallowed before it reached another ear. He would climb the tallest fig tree at dawn and speak aloud the dreams he had gathered in sleep, of rivers that never dried, of people who listened with their whole selves, of a fire that never burned but always warmed. He spoke to the wind, to the stones, to the sun as it climbed, and though nothing answered, he never stopped. One morning, as he sat among the branches, an old woman appeared below. She had no name anymore, only wrinkles folded with sorrow, and she said softly, "Tell it again." Startled, Jael repeated his dream. When he finished, the woman whispered, "That was mine too." And then she wept. They met again the next day, and the next. Others joined one at first, then 3, then many. Not because the stories were perfect, but because they had waited too long in silence. Jael's words were not grand, but they opened a door, and through that door a people remembered they were not alone. The stories returned, not written, but spoken, not taught, but shared, not owned, but given. And the people became whole, not through conquest, but through voice. The fire burned again, not in brightness, but in the warmth of being heard. In another land, across dry plains and silver lakes, lived a shepherdess named Rena, whose flock numbered only 5, and whose joy seemed to outgrow her small frame. She hummed as she walked, not because she was free of sorrow, but because she had learned to sing even while carrying it. One day, a merchant passed her trail and mocked her for wasting her life on animals. "There is no reward in walking circles," he scoffed. But Rena only smiled and said, "Even circles can lead home." That night, she found the merchant's wagon turned and broken by a hidden ditch. Without judgment, she lit her lamp, tended his wounds, and gave him her cloak. He asked her why. She replied, "Because the flame is not mine to keep, it is only mine to pass." The merchant, who had once traded gold and spices, returned to the cities not with treasures, but with stories of a shepherd girl whose kindness bent the path of his life. And those who listened began to seek her, not to worship, but to walk beside. The fire had found her, and through her it walked on. So the tale wins, through hills and valleys, through silence and song, always resting in hearts ready to carry it. Not the loud, not the strong, but the willing. And still it asks, not with thunder, but with whisper, "Will you be the next to carry the flame?" Asterisk. And in the west, where cliffs kissed the ocean and storms wrote poems in the sky, lived an old sailor named Malik. He had once been a man of storms, his hands calloused by war, his eyes dimmed by betrayal. In youth, he had commanded ships, earned villages, and taken what was not his. But now, in the hush of age, he lived alone in a hut of driftwood, mending nets he no longer cast. People feared him still, though his sword lay buried beneath the Dethi sand. One day, a child wandered to his fire, hungry and lost. Malik gave him fish. When the boy asked about the sword marks on his arms, Malik answered not with words, but with a story of choices, of regret, of a fire he once tried to extinguish, but found again when he had nothing left. The boy returned the next day, and the day after, bringing others, who also carried wounds no one could see. They sat with Malek as he told the old tales, not of glory, but of forgiveness. The flame had not forsaken him. It had waited for the silence to deepen, for the pride to fall away. And in the end, it found him ready, not to lead, but to teach, not to speak of greatness, but of grace. And so, like water that carves stone, not with strength, but with patience, the fire spread. From Jael to Rena, from Miriam to Leah, from Oren to Malek, from hands unknown to hearts unnamed. It crossed borders, defied empires, outlived kings. And now, in this very breath, it stands before you, not as command, not as burden, but as invitation, for the fire still searches. For those who will carry it not with pride, but with love. Not with noise, but with quiet courage. Will you walk where others turned away? Will you light the cold path for one more soul? Will you speak when silence would be easier? If so, take this story not to keep, but to give. For stories, like fire, only live when shared. And so it was that the flame, older than the stars, yet younger than the breath of a newborn, passed from soul to soul, unseen by those who seek greatness, but always found by those who walk lowly, those who listen, those who love without reward. The fire did not consume, but refined. It did not blind, but revealed. It did not lift the proud, but raised the meek. Through silence and sorrow, through joy and simple hands, it carried the light of the one who first spoke light into the void. The mountains will pass away, and the seas will dry, but this fire shall remain. Not in temples of stone nor thrones of gold, but in the whisper of mercy, the embrace of the forgotten, the footsteps of those who go where they are not seen. And to the end of days, and the day beyond end, it shall still speak not with thunder, but with truth. You are not alone. The flame is with you. Amen.